All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, I will be investigating task difficulty framing and how teachers' use of this might affect student success. Teachers play a crucial role in fostering the educations of students from their first day of kindergarten to the last day of their college career. That's why it's crucial for teachers to be aware of how their actions and words actually affect students, both positively and negatively. One form of interaction between teachers and students is task difficulty. Task difficulty framing is the way that a task is framed by a teacher with their context. For example, teachers don't just wordlessly hand out assignments. They might say that the task is long, or how it connects to the assignment, or of interest, how difficult it is. Words like easy and difficult might be thrown around casually, but could these small language choices actually affect student success? That leads me to my central question. Does the framing of task difficulty by teachers affect student success outcomes? First, let's look at the literature. If we look at the research by Newton and Kiabke, they find that student expectation actually affects student success. When students expect difficulties higher than the actual task, they are more likely to be intimidated, to not give the appropriate dedication required, or to look for hidden complexity when there really isn't any. On the other hand, when students expect lower difficulties than the actual task, they are more likely to be focused on one superficial aspect, or to be lulled into a false sense of security. Because of this, it's important for students to be aware what the actual expectations of the task are. And so if teachers additionally lead students astray by using easy or difficult, that might also affect student success. Research by Hom and Maxwell explored intrinsic motivation with relation to difficulty framing. Their investigation looked at 32 5th and 6th grade students and gave them a pursuit rotor task, which has a screen where motion is done and the students are asked to use a stylus to follow along. The researchers gave the students framing of either easy, hard, or no framing, and they found that, quote, task expectation did not produce a significant difference among the three conditions in the amount of time on target. They weren't satisfied with this conclusion though, so they did a second experiment, this time with 47 undergraduates, and gave them anagram tests on different note cards. Again, they told the students that it was either an easy or a hard anagram, and again, they found that no performance differences were found as a function of task expectation. Based on this research, it appears that task framing does not affect task difficulty, and the use of easy and difficult would not create differences in success. However, when Scassera in his master's thesis did a similar experiment, he came to a different conclusion. He took 21 undergraduates and gave them an anagram test, with the first page labeled as easy, the second as medium, and the last as hard. And he found that, quote, there was a significant linear effect found for a difficulty using repeated measures ANOVA, which stands for analysis of variance, supporting the main hypothesis that task performance would worsen as a result of increased perceived task difficulty. Because of this, there's a clear gap in the research between how perception of task difficulty and how the framing of that actually affects student success in the long run. So now, next let's go to my experimental methodology. I'd like to preface this by saying that I performed an anagram test and that students were asked to perform a post-test survey. But before we look into that in more detail, let's first look at the sample. The sample collected was of 352 Minnesotan high school students that all attend the same College Preparatory High School. However, only 316 of the 352 responses were actually used. The other 36 were discarded for a variety of reasons, including labeling that they had previously taken the test, misunderstanding the task and not actually doing anagrams, or not completing all of the survey questions. Here, we have the distribution of gender, with 163 being male and 153 being female. One individual marked themselves as both female and other, but for the purposes of analysis, were grouped in with females. We also have the distribution of the sample age, with the mean age being 15.78, and you can see we had a large sample size for 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Next, let's look at the actual framing of the task. Students took the test during their own science class, and the information was distributed by their own science teachers. Because of this, we were able to mitigate feelings of experimentation and also better emulate the real stresses and pressure of a traditional classroom environment. Additionally, teachers gave contextual framing. First, they defined an anagram as a word that rearranges to spell another word, like my example here of thing to night. Additionally, students were told that they would be taking an anagram test, that the words on the test would be common words that would be relatively easy to spell, and that they would only have 5 minutes to complete as many of the 15 anagrams as possible. Additionally, teachers told the students that the test was either very easy or very difficult, and they're asked to do this at least twice, but preferably 3 or 4 times. Additionally, it's important to remember that teachers were verbally instructed on what to say by me, and then additionally given a bulleted list for a reminder when they were actually doing the experiment. Now, let's look a little bit more on what the actual anagram test involved. Anagrams were chosen for a few reasons, primarily of their ease in understanding and the lack of necessity for prior knowledge. If an individual did have prior knowledge in anagrams, they were unlikely to be more successful than those who did not. Additionally, the relatively difficult aspects that revolve around anagrams made it so it was unlikely for individuals to complete all of the anagrams on the test or to fail all of them, which made a better distribution of scores. Additionally, it's important to remember that the research by both Maham and Maxwell, as well as Gacera, both use anagrams in their research, so it better fit into the academic space. Additionally, students were only in the building half the time with alternating schedules, except for 9th graders who were in person every day. Because of this, 2 tests were created, Test A and Test B, so that students in the same class but had different days would not be able to communicate answers. This was done to reduce error in general. Additionally, only in-person students were tested. This was done to reduce possibilities of cheating, including the possibility of use of digital word unscramblers, the use of more than 5 minutes when doing the anagram, or outside communication with friends or family, or even other students in the class. Additionally, the anagram test had 15 words, and the students only had 5 minutes to complete as much as they could. Next, let's look at the post-test survey. Students first were asked if they had completed a similar anagram test for other classes. This question was made to be purposely vague so that students wouldn't catch on that this was a school-wide event, and so that they'd be less likely to talk about it outside of class. However, because of the vague questioning, it's most likely that some people answered yes when really they had not taken the test before for AP research. Because of this, the 36 individuals that were discarded, many of them might have accidentally marked it, but since 36 is not too large of a number based on our large sample size, we did not decide to change and rearrange. Additionally, we have the demographics and information that we asked for, including gender, age, number of honors and AP classes, as well as number of hours spent each night doing homework. Then, we used a 7-point Likert chart to analyze some more elements, including how difficult individual students thought the activity was, how well they think they did compared to other students, as well as how stressed they were in general over the entire assignment. Finally, students were asked how confident they are in their reading and writing skills, and how dedicated they are to sports and extracurricular activities. After they completed the survey, students were told this was for an AP research class and that they should not discuss it outside of the classroom. Next, let's look at my hypothesis. Based on research by Newton and Kiabke, it seems that perceived difficulty is affected by how students believe the task is going to be, and that would affect scores. But the research from Ham and Maxwell, as well as Gacera, found that individually students were not affected by framing for Ham and Maxwell, while Gacera found that they were affected. So because of this, I would have to side with Newton and Kiabke and Gacera when I'm making my hypothesis. They say that I hypothesize that students who were told the task was easy or by teachers would have better scores in general on the anagram test than those that were told the task was difficult. Next, let's look at my results. It's important before I look into my results, I explain how I found statistical significance. I used a single factor analysis of variance test, specifically an F-test. This was chosen because it would be using 2 different samples rather than comparing to the entire population. Additionally, an alpha value of 0.05 was chosen, the alpha value being just the determinant of significance. 0.05 was chosen based on its popular use in academic space, as well as the unlikelihood of large ramifications from having a false positive result. Additionally, the p-values that will be calculated by the F-test represent the probability that the 2 samples came from the same population. So a smaller sample size means that the smaller p-value makes it so that it's more likely that they came from different populations, which means it's more likely to be significant. First, let's look at Test A and Test B. Test A differs in difficulty from Test B significantly. If you see this p-value of 0.006, that represents a probability of about 0.6% chance that they came from the same populations. Since this is less than our determined alpha value of 0.05, representing a max cap of 5%, it is considered significant, with Test A being more significantly easier than Test B. And you can see the distribution of scores here. Because of this, we decided to use a block design when looking at when comparing tests. So students that took Test A were only compared with students who took Test A, and students that took Test B were only compared to students who took Test B. Next, let's look at the core investigation of difficulty framing. For both Test A and Test B, easy and difficult framing was found to be not significant, with a p-value of 12% and 64.5% respectively, greater than our alpha value of 5%. So because of this, we can side with Ham and Maxwell in our investigation that easy and difficult framings did not affect student scores. Next, let's look at some limitations. Because there was an unstandardized framing, as I pointed out, there was 9 different teachers, and they gave the framing 39 different times. Additionally, since they didn't have a pre-written script, it's unlikely that they would have said the same framing every single time. And so because of this, we likely introduced more error than was actually necessary. The purpose of this was to try to make it more realistic to a traditional environment, but it likely introduced more error than was completely necessary. Additionally, to keep answers anonymous and to keep students anonymous, we asked them to not write their names. This also likely introduced more error because students would be more likely to lack total motivation because they would have realized that they weren't graded on the task and they wouldn't have experienced the same academic stress. So it's important to remember this when applying this research outside of this context. Additionally, the applicability of the results on a grander scale is important. The sample size was only of high school students and they all attended the same college preparatory school. Different age groups, especially younger age groups, might be affected differently than high school students. Like younger students might have more of a dependence and trust on their teachers. And additionally, students in other school systems, like public schools or charter schools, might not have the same results as a college preparatory school. Areas of further research. Firstly, you could address some areas of limitation, as I pointed out previously, just more consistent framing as well as external motivation, like the reward for a grade by having people put their names. Additionally, various age groups could be tested, including elementary school students and middle school students who might have more of a dependence on their teacher and more trust in what the teacher is saying. Additionally, various other forms of framing could be done, such as the amount of context given to the task, as well as the mood and tone of a teacher, if a more angry or subtle mood actually affected how students did in general. Now, in conclusion, we can see that my central question of whether task framing was whether success scores were affected by task framing by teachers, it appears that this is not. Based on the hypothesis, we negate our hypothesis because the hypothesis stated that students would do better on average when they were told it was easy, but since the results show that student success scores did not change, it is unlikely to matter in the grand scheme of things. Additionally, teachers in general don't need to change their teaching styles if they use framing test difficulty because they don't need to worry about accidentally stifling their students, whether they say easy or difficult.
Thank you, Mason. Mason, some questions. How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final question or project goal?
That's a great question. So when I was originally investigating task difficulty and task difficulty framing, and I found the results of Scarsera versus Hamm and Maxwell, it really showed me that there was a gap between how students did with regards to that task difficulty framing, and so that really situated my question in general because I realized that there was a space to investigate and that it wasn't a topic that had been overly done. And so that allowed me to ask the question of whether task framing, especially since it was usually tested by researchers in general and not teachers, so I believe that by putting it into a more applicable space of teachers and students, it would expand on the results and also fill that gap.
Okay, kind of building on that question, how do your findings provide direction for future research in this field?
As I mentioned a few slides ago about my possibilities of further research, I think that some areas of error that I pointed out could be addressed. I also addressed some of areas of error of both Hamm and Maxwell and Scarsera that they pointed out, and I think that's a way that further research can be done is by honing and addressing some of those areas of error. Additionally, various age group testings with teachers especially could be done. I think that middle school students and elementary school students might be more affected, and so that might be more interesting, especially since they're in a more developmental stage. Additionally, the various forms of framing outside of difficulty framing would also give an opportunity with amount of context and mood and tone of the teacher.
Okay. Think back to your initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
So I think I was really interested in the psychology of individuals, and so this was a branching off of that of the psychology between students and teachers. And I think because of my experience in this experiment, I was able to better realize how studies can be done in these fields and how it doesn't necessarily need to be the most complex. Although I did a lot of preparation and I did a lot of analysis afterwards, it wasn't actually the most complex to actually administer and set up. And so it made me realize that I could, in the future, investigate psychology much easier than I initially thought.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well done.